A new conflict is threatening to erupt in South America. After years of isolation, sanctions, and economic decline, it seems the United States has finally run out of patience with Venezuela. Criminal organizations inside the country, with the help of the Venezuelan government, have become key players in drug trafficking routes that end up in Uncle Sam's backyard. And the political situation does not give much room for hope either. Inside Venezuela, many people are willing to do almost anything to put an end to Nicolas Maduro's tyranny and the entire Chavista regime. But this is fish memoirs. So the real questions we need to ask are, where does this conflict come from? And is there truly a risk of military escalation? Get comfortable, because we are about to find out. The relationship between Venezuela and the United States hasn't always been this tense. For much of the 20th century, both countries were close allies, since the United States wanted strong influence in Latin America, and Venezuela was more than happy to receive that attention. A clear example can be found back in 1902, when European powers blockaded the Venezuelan coast, demanding repayment of debts owed to them. With the discovery of oil in Venezuela in 1914, that friendship grew even stronger. The ruler Juan Vicente Gómez granted generous concessions to American companies to extract that black gold, which thrilled Washington and brought massive investment into the country. During World War II, their alliance reached its peak. Venezuela supplied crucial oil to the United States and its allies, and openly declared solidarity with Washington after Pearl Harbor. In the Cold War that followed, the two nations remained close. The United States supported anti-communist Latin American dictators without much hesitation, and Venezuela proudly embraced its own fierce anti-communism. After 1958, Venezuela returned to democracy and became one of the United States' favorite political models in Latin America. By the late 1990s, Venezuela and the US were key commercial partners. Venezuela sold most of its oil to the American market and bought many of its consumer goods from the US. Ideological differences were minimal, and the relationship looked solid. But this honeymoon was about to end with the arrival of a new protagonist in Caracas. In 1998, Venezuela elected Hugo Chavez as president, a charismatic former lieutenant colonel, known for leading a failed coup in 1992. His rise to power marked a turning point in relations with Washington. Chavez brought a nationalist, left-wing, and openly defiant message against the United States, completely different from his predecessors. He quickly built a close friendship with Fidel Castro in Cuba, and from that moment on, things stopped running smoothly between Washington and Caracas. Cuba became one of the most important battlegrounds between the two nations. While the US had spent decades trying to isolate the communist government in Havana, Venezuela suddenly began sending cheap oil to the island and aligning itself politically with Castro. As you can imagine, Washington didn't like that one bit. Overnight, a former oil ally was supporting its greatest ideological enemy in the region. Chavez also sought a bigger role on the global stage, something that made the United States extremely uncomfortable. In the year 2000, he toured OPEC countries to push for agreements that would raise oil prices. He even became the first foreign head of state to visit Saddam Hussein in Iraq after the Gulf War, something seen as shocking at the time. And while Venezuela continued selling oil to the US, Chavez made it clear he wanted a higher price per barrel, prioritizing revenue even if it meant more expensive gasoline for the Americans. At the same time, he began building ties with other governments far from friendly to Washington, including Iran, Russia, and China. The tensions finally exploded into open crisis in April 2002, when a short-lived coup in Caracas removed Chavez from power for 2 days. The US government under George W. Bush was not directly involved, at least officially, but it publicly welcomed the temporary regime that replaced Chavez during those 48 hours. Chavez was furious. From that point on, it became common to see him insulting President Bush in public speeches and on television. Remember when he said, "It smells like sulfur here?" Or, "Mr. Bush, you are a donkey." Or that moment when he expelled the US ambassador shouting, "Yankees, go to hell." Well, that was the tone of the relationship. Hugo Chavez died in 2013, but the tension certainly didn't die with him. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited not only the presidency, but also the conflict with Washington. At first, some wondered whether Maduro might soften his tone to ease the relationship. The answer came quickly, and it was a clear no. One early example was his offer of political asylum to Edward Snowden in 2013. Between 2014 and 2015, Venezuela saw massive opposition protests, with accusations of violent repression by Maduro's government. By late 2014, the US Congress approved a law to sanction Venezuelan officials involved in human rights abuses during those demonstrations. The era of sanctions had begun. And in March 2015, President Obama signed an executive order declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, imposing sanctions on 7 high-ranking Venezuelan officials. The arrival of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency in 2017 took the confrontation to a whole new level. If Obama had been firm but still relatively diplomatic, Trump chose a strategy of full maximum pressure. His administration saw Maduro as a new Castro, or maybe even worse, and made no effort to hide its desire for regime change in Venezuela. In 2017, Maduro pushed for a highly controversial constituent assembly that excluded the opposition entirely. The United States responded with even tougher sanctions. It froze the assets of top Chavista officials and banned American citizens and banks from purchasing new Venezuelan debt. By the end of 2018, Maduro was re-elected in a vote widely questioned for fraud. And then, in January 2019, everything exploded when opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president of Venezuela, citing the Constitution. The United States immediately recognized Guaidó as the legitimate president, followed by dozens of countries around the world. Maduro, of course, accused Washington of orchestrating a coup attempt against him through a puppet. Furious, he broke diplomatic relations with the United States and gave American diplomats 72 hours to leave the country. The U.S. Embassy in Caracas shut down and moved its operations to neighboring Colombia. Guaidó's adventure did not succeed, and Maduro remained firmly in power. In response to the failed maneuver, Washington went nuclear on the economic front. That same year, it imposed a total oil embargo. American companies were banned from buying Venezuelan crude or doing business with PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. Since the U.S. was the main destination for Venezuela's oil, this suffocated the regime's finances. The U.S. also sanctioned the Venezuelan central bank, restricted fuel imports, and encouraged allies to freeze Venezuelan state assets abroad, handing control of some of them, like the CITGO refinery in the U.S., to Guaidó's team. For Venezuela, already drowning in hyperinflation and shortages, it was a brutal blow. And for Trump, it was supposed to be the final squeeze that would force Maduro out. But instead of surrendering, Maduro dug in, backed by Russia, China, Cuba, and a few other allies. In March 2020, the confrontation reached an unprecedented and almost Hollywood-style level. The U.S. Department of Justice formally charged Nicolas Maduro and several of his top officials with running a drug trafficking cartel, and even offered multi-million-dollar rewards for information leading to their capture. For example, they put a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head, something never seen before against a sitting head of state. 2020 also saw some truly bizarre incidents. In May, a small group of mercenaries and Venezuelan dissidents attempted to infiltrate the coast with the supposed mission of capturing Maduro. This clandestine plan later became known as Operation Gideon, and it was an absolute disaster. Venezuelan security forces were waiting for them and arrested most of the group with barely any resistance. The strangest part is that among those detained were 2 former U.S. soldiers, giving Maduro even more fuel to claim the whole thing was a plot orchestrated by the CIA or the White House. The U.S. elections at the end of 2020 brought another shift. Donald Trump lost, and in January 2021, Joe Biden became president. Some expected Biden, with his more traditional style, to lower the confrontation and ease the pressure. In practice, the policy toward Venezuela did not change. Most economic sanctions remained in place, and Biden and his advisors made it clear that they would not recognize Maduro as the legitimate president and that the pressure would continue until there were real steps toward restoring democracy in Venezuela. That said, there were diplomatic attempts to improve the situation. Washington supported negotiations between Maduro's government and the opposition, hosted by countries like Norway and held in Mexico starting in 2021. The idea was simple: set the conditions for free elections in exchange for some sanctions relief. But there were many ups and downs, talks that collapsed, then resumed, promises that were broken and revived. Still, the line of communication remained open. Meanwhile, the global humanitarian and energy crisis of 2022, worsened by the war in Ukraine, pushed the United States to make a few small gestures. With the world needing more oil, Biden sent envoys to Caracas to explore a limited easing of oil sanctions. Surprisingly, in 2022, the White House allowed Chevron, one of the last American oil companies in Venezuela, to partially resume operations to extract and export a small amount of Venezuelan crude. There were also prisoner exchanges that showed some level of communication. In 2024, Maduro finally allowed presidential elections to take place, but the fraud was absolute. Without presenting a single piece of evidence, Maduro declared himself the winner and much of the opposition was forced back into hiding. And then Trump returned. His second administration wasted no time in toughening its stance toward Venezuela. If there was even a tiny trace of mild diplomacy left, it vanished immediately. In August 2025, Washington took a step that pushed the confrontation into dangerous territory. The United States ordered a major military deployment in the Caribbean, right next to Venezuelan waters. Within weeks, 8 U.S. warships, including destroyers and amphibious assault ships, carrying more than 4,000 troops, were positioned across the southern Caribbean. They were joined by aircraft such as P-8 surveillance planes, and there were even reports of a nuclear submarine in the area. Officially, the White House insisted that these were counter-narcotics operations, meant to stop drug shipments allegedly leaving Venezuela. But many fear these forces could launch a direct attack against Maduro's regime or support an armed uprising by the opposition. Finally, the situation escalated to the limit after the United States bombed 2 Venezuelan drug running boats that, according to U.S. authorities, were linked to the Tren de Aragua criminal organization. Maduro accused the United States of killing fishermen and declared that Venezuela's national sovereignty had been violated. In response, Venezuela activated an emergency defensive plan called Operation Independence 200. Maduro called on civilians to enlist in the Bolivarian militia, and his government declared that to hesitate is to betray. In a bold and frankly risky move, the Venezuelan Air Force sent F-16 fighter jets to fly close over one of the U.S. warships as a warning that they were ready to stand up and fight. At the same time, 25,000 troops were deployed to defend the Caribbean regions. President Trump warned that U.S. forces would shoot down any threat approaching their military units, and to make that message crystal clear, he ordered F-35 fighter jets to deploy to the U.S. base in Puerto Rico. And that brings us to where we are today. It is highly unlikely that the United States would launch a full-scale war against Venezuela on its own, although we definitely cannot rule out the possibility that these same troops could support some kind of coup attempt against Maduro. Even so, the most probable explanation is that the United States wants to cut off the financial lifeline that Maduro's regime gets from drug trafficking in order to choke it even further. In fact, the bounty on the Venezuelan dictator has been raised to $50 million. For Washington, Maduro's fall would be quite the prize. First, it could pull a country full of oil, gas, and gold back into the U.S. sphere of influence. It would also send a strong message of determination and victory to the world. Trump would earn huge approval from a large part of the Latino community in the U.S., and he could finally cooperate with a potential new government to drag Venezuela out of the hands of organized crime. And on top of all that, a major side effect of Maduro's fall would be a sharp reduction in Chinese, Iranian, and Russian influence in South America and the Caribbean. So now the question is for you, what do you think the United States is really trying to achieve with this military deployment in the Caribbean Sea? And is Maduro's Venezuela close to collapsing? We'll see you in the comments, and that's all for today's video. You know the drill. If you enjoyed the story, give it a like, hit subscribe, and dive in for the next one.